My name is Heather, and at the age of 38, I had just received the most heartless goodbye in history. But while Alan was probably enjoying his grand departure, confident that I was sitting in tears cursing his betrayal, I calmly locked the doors of my boutique, as I did every night, without trembling in my heart. No pain in my arms, no chest pain, no regrets about the years I spent with a man who once seemed like a reliable life partner to me. The signs were too obvious to ignore, and if he thought I'd been living in sweet ignorance until the last moment, it meant he knew me a lot worse than I'd ever imagined. Late nights at the office, which strangely coincided with expensive restaurant receipts, brand new clothes bought by a man who had previously ignored his wardrobe, an abrupt password change on his phone, and this careless attempt to convince me to combine our accounts, when I already knew that by that time he had long since started prepare the ground for escape. I silently watched his game, knowing that I had my own trump card up my sleeve. He left, convinced that I was crushed, that I would beg him to stay, that I would experience pain comparable to that experienced by his young, naive Melissa when he abandoned her after a year or two, exchanging her for another young assistant who would laugh just as stupidly at his jokes and so on. I'm devoutly hanging on his every word. I did not reply to his message, in which he officially informed me that he was leaving with Melissa, that he would send things to pick up later, that he was sorry, but that was how it happened. I just picked up the phone, dialed the number of my lawyer, whom I had been consulting for several months when I first suspected something was wrong, and calmly, without unnecessary emotions, said, "The time has come." Did he just make his move? Her voice was businesslike, crisp, without a trace of sympathy or surprise. "Oh, yes. The documents are ready. Do you want me to sue them in Miami?" "Don't rush, let him think he's won." I smiled a little, imagining how he arrogantly enjoys the illusion of his impunity. I dropped the phone on the table and sat down, slowly looking at the space around me. This house, which has always been mine, despite his numerous attempts to convince me to add his name to the documents, despite the years he spent here, thinking that he had at least some right to it. My intuition has never failed me, and today I was grateful to myself for not giving in. My gaze fell on an old wedding album, which I once kept so carefully, but now leafed through with amazing indifference. Alan in the photos was completely different, not the pathetic man who was stuck in his midlife crisis, desperately clinging to youth with the help of too tight shirts and ridiculous phrases that he had picked up from his 20-year-old subordinates. At the time, he seemed mature, reliable, and even noble to me, but as it turned out, it was all just a beautiful illusion. My phone vibrated again. One more message. "I know it's hard for you. You're not getting any younger, but at least you have your little shop to keep you busy." I chuckled a little, surprised at how low he had fallen, trying to hurt me with words that should have made me feel like a loser. My little shop is a successful boutique that I built from scratch, which generated more income than his mediocre job as a middle-level manager, which he once offered to sell to me because, in his opinion, I already spent too much time on it. What a pity that he had no idea that I had started preparing for his departure, long before he made the final decision. I opened the folder with the documents in which I kept all the evidence of his lies, screenshots of messages, bank statements, checks confirming his infidelities. Every time he thought I'd been tricked, he only trapped himself more. Another message. "I've been planning this for months. Melissa understands me in a way you never could. You're going to be fine. Maybe you'll find someone to match yourself." I calmly took a screenshot, adding it to the evidence I had already collected. Let him continue to dig himself a hole, let him enjoy his imaginary triumph, let him consider himself a winner. My lawyer will be glad of his indiscretion. The last message caught my attention. "By the way, I'm using a shared card to book our flights and hotel. Consider this my parting gift. Lol." Perfect. I calmly picked up my phone, scrolled through my contact list, and clicked on the number I needed. The polite, practiced voice on the other end of the line answered almost instantly. The credit company Meadley, how can I help? Good evening, Mrs. Harrison. I need to report fraudulent payments and cancel the card immediately. Of course, ma'am. Can you identify the payments? Two first-class tickets to Miami booked today, the cost of accommodation at the Royal Palm Hotel, and I also need to remove my husband from the list of authorized users. Do you have any documents confirming the fraud? I smiled as I opened Alan's messages. I have text messages from my husband in which he explicitly admits that he used our joint card to pay for a trip with a girl after emptying our shared bank account. I will be happy to forward them to you. The professional tone of the representative could not hide the note of satisfaction when she confirmed the cancellation of payments. Thank you, Mrs. Harrison. You're welcome, ma'am. Alan and his young companion will arrive at the airport tomorrow and discover that their tickets are invalid. Their hotel reservation has also been canceled. I wish you a good evening. I turned off the phone and stretched, feeling a pleasant lightness in my shoulders. It was more than just revenge, it was the restoration of justice. After a few minutes, the phone screen lit up again. Don't worry about the house. I'll let you stay there until you find something smaller. I actually laughed out loud. Did he really think he had any rights to my grandmother's house? Did his ego grow so big that he forgot whose name was on the documents? The next call came 5 minutes later. I know that the store means a lot to you. We can negotiate a fair payment for your half. My half, my business, which I built myself, financed myself, while he complained about my long working hours and called it my hobby. I opened the cupboard, took out a bottle of wine that I had saved for a special occasion, poured a glass, watching the amber liquid trickle down the glass. This moment was qualified. Tomorrow Alan will learn the harsh truth about property rights and separate assets. But tonight I enjoyed the silence. The morning brought a flurry of increasingly angry messages from Alan. What the hell did you do with our credit card? The airline won't accept our tickets. The hotel canceled our reservation. Answer me. I turned off my phone, finished my coffee, and went to the boutique. Today is Friday, the busiest day, and I had enough to do not to waste time on his tantrum. Around noon, the phone rang. His mother's name appeared on the screen. Heather, dear Alan told us everything. I turned on the speakerphone, arranging a new batch of bags in the window. Really? He said that you controlled him, that you drove him away, that you're vindictive and now you're causing problems with his trips. I chuckled. Did he mention that he had drained our joint account, that I paid for tickets for myself and my girlfriend with our joint card? A silence. He said that you left him no choice, that you were cold and distant. I frowned. Barbara, I have his messages. Do you want me to read them to you? The one where he brags that he took all the money, or the one where he makes fun of my age? Silence again. He did sound a little cruel. I told him that this message was inappropriate. I appreciate the call, Barbara. I've always liked you, but I think we'd better end this conversation. My lawyer advised me to minimize contact with his family during the proceedings. By the end of the day, news about Alan had spread among mutual acquaintances. His sister Amanda, who has always been the queen of family gossip, told friends that Alan and Melissa were stuck in a budget motel near the airport. Their dreams of a luxurious Miami were temporarily dashed. He tried to use his personal credit cards, but, as it turned out, they had been exhausted several months ago. Another alarming signal is that my lawyer called with an update. An emergency hearing is scheduled for Monday, she said, sounding confident and even a little enthusiastic. Given his admission of emptying the joint account and the documented credit card fraud, we have every reason to freeze all remaining assets. Has he received the notification yet? Not yet, but it will be received in the next few hours. We sent the documents to a new address, at the motel. I chuckled. Speaking of which, she continued, his girlfriend's social media accounts provide us with excellent evidence. She's been posting about their adventure all day, including some pretty glowing comments about you. I smiled, remembering my own carefully compiled documentation, the annual amount of suspicious expenses, hotel receipts, payments for flowers and jewelry that never reached me, screenshots of his messages where he smugly told me how he got rid of me, as if I were an old sofa and not a wife, who had endured his selfishness for years. He was so focused on his great escape that he didn't even realize that I was carefully watching and recording his every mistake. My phone vibrated again. You think you're so smart, but I've made copies of all the financial statements of the boutique. Half of this business is mine. I exhaled slowly, forwarded this message to my lawyer, and added it to the growing file of Alan's careless statements. Let him learn the hard way what separate assets are and what it means to own a business registered exclusively in my name. Sometimes the best revenge is just good preparation. The emergency hearing on Monday was all I could have hoped for. Alan showed up at the courthouse in his new youth wardrobe, skinny designer jeans not designed for his age, a blazer that screamed of a midlife crisis, and a grin that hid nervous anticipation. Melissa was waiting outside the courthouse, her youth even more painfully obvious under the bright lights. She fiddled with her purse nervously, keeping her eyes on the phone screen. Apparently, Alan hadn't informed her about the details of today's proceedings. My lawyer methodically presented the evidence. Your Honor, this is a happy message from Mr. Harrison, in which he admits to deliberately emptying the joint account. We also provided proof of credit card fraud, a documented history of hidden expenses, and details of suspicious transactions that continued over the past year. All the materials were carefully collected during the observation process. Alan's lawyer tried to object. My client admits that he made some rash decisions, but Mrs. Harrison's actions were frankly vindictive and calculated. My lawyer didn't even blink. Calculating? Do you mean prudent? My client was protecting her assets, which were out of marital possession from the very beginning. She kept detailed records of her husband's suspicious behavior. This is not vindictiveness. It's common sense. The judge opened the documents and slowly flipped through them. Mr. Harrison, he said to Alan, looking up, you admit in a text message that you deliberately emptied a joint account and used shared credit cards to finance a trip with your girlfriend. Do you deny it? Alan shifted uncomfortably. I was just trying to get away from her. By committing financial fraud, the judge raised an eyebrow. And now you are claiming the property, which, as the documentation shows, was separated from the marital assets from the very beginning. Alan's lawyer cleared his throat nervously. The business grew during their marriage. My client is entitled to a portion of it. My lawyer wouldn't even let him finish. The boutique was founded before the marriage, and throughout the years of their marriage, Mrs. Harrison ensured a strict separation of business and personal finances. We have complete documentation confirming that Mr. Harrison was never involved in this business, did not invest in it, and did not participate in its management. I watched Alan's face carefully. For the first time, he looked confused. It was slowly but surely beginning to sink in. He thought it would be easy to empty the accounts, run away with a new love, and then maybe get half of my business in a divorce. He never bothered to understand why I had been so careful to keep my finances separate all these years. He ridiculed my meticulousness, saying that I was too serious about accounting. Now it's ruined him. The judge put down the papers. The court finds sufficient evidence of financial irregularities. In this regard, all joint assets are frozen until the final dissolution of the marriage. Alan inhaled sharply, as if he had just realized the scale of the disaster. Is this some kind of mistake? Your self-confident disregard for the legal consequences of your actions was a mistake, the judge replied calmly. The hearing is over. Mr. Harrison is ordered to return all funds withdrawn from the joint accounts within 24 hours. But this money, of course, has already disappeared. We spent it, Alan exclaimed, clearly trying to make himself look like a victim of circumstances, as if the money had just evaporated, and he had not been happy to spend it on tickets, expensive hotels, and probably countless cocktails that he treated his young companion to. We can't just return them. The judge looked at him with undisguised skepticism. Mr. Harrison, the court is very wary of using joint credit cards to finance your adventures with your mistress, he remarked dryly before declaring the meeting closed. I got up, buttoned my jacket, and left the room, ignoring the muffled voices behind me. Somewhere in the background, I could hear Melissa quietly asking Alan what would happen to their trip to Miami now. His answer was lost in the sound of my heels tapping confidently on the marble floor as I walked to the exit, heading back to the business he had never understood or respected. The next few weeks brought a series of increasingly desperate moves on Alan's part. At first, he claimed that the idea of opening a boutique belonged to him, that he inspired me to start this business, that he had once supported me. Then he remembered that he had allegedly invested money in it at the very beginning. Then he started calling himself my business partner, claiming that all this time he had played an important role in the management of the store. His statements were shattered by my careful notes. Every investment in the business is documented, my lawyer explained calmly, barely able to contain his satisfaction with what was happening. Every profit, every expense, every check, everything is filed in the reports. There is no evidence that your husband was ever involved in the financing of the boutique. Alan was getting desperate. My lawyer noticed that his girlfriend was now posting on social media that they were living in her studio apartment. Obviously, living on an administrator's salary is not exactly the glamorous journey that Alan imagined. And suddenly, Alan's family started to get in touch. Their tone was strikingly different from what it was in the early days. We didn't know anything, his sister Amanda confessed in one of the voicemails. He told us that you were cold, that you were in control, that he needed to escape. But then we saw his messages. How he bragged about taking your money. This is not the brother I knew. His mother called again, this time in tears. What did he say about your age? About replacing you with someone younger? I raised him better. I thought that's what I did. I transferred their calls to voicemail. Their support might have meant something a few weeks ago, but now it seemed like fleeing from a sinking ship. Meanwhile, my boutique was thriving. Ironically, the local gossip surrounding my divorce has brought me a wave of new clients. Women came to the store specifically to express their support, and left, often buying much more than they had planned. My ex tried the same thing, one of the customers confessed, trying on a designer handbag. I thought he would take everything away with the divorce. Such men never expect us to be smarter than them. I nodded, knowing exactly what she was talking about. My phone was still vibrating from time to time with messages from Alan. His tone fluctuated between rage and attempts at manipulation. You've ruined everything. I never meant to hurt you. You'll regret being so vindictive. Can we come to some kind of agreement? This business would be nothing without my support. I didn't answer. I just forwarded every message to my lawyer, allowing Alan to continue digging the hole he had driven himself into. And from conversations with mutual acquaintances, I heard that Melissa was starting to change her mind. Obviously, sharing a tiny studio apartment with a middle-aged man who couldn't even afford to rent his own home turned out to be not the romantic adventure it seemed to her at first. The age difference, which had once been fascinating during secret meetings at the hotel, was now perceived differently in the harsh light of reality. Yesterday, she wrote on social media about a toxic relationship and lessons learned. This morning, her in a relationship status disappeared. I almost felt sorry for Alan. Almost. But then I remembered his casual, haha. When he told me that he had emptied our account, I remembered his messages full of contempt and self-satisfaction. I remembered how he decided without a shadow of a doubt that I would remain helpless, lost, crushed without him, as he had no doubt that I would give up, that I had nowhere else to go, that I couldn't handle it alone. I remembered how he made fun of my age, how he believed that replacing me with someone younger was not just his right, but a logical development of events. And instead of feeling pity, I felt something completely different: pride. For my foresight, for not allowing emotions to overshadow common sense, for my ability to protect myself while he continued to underestimate me. The last divorce hearing painted a very different picture than Alan had imagined. His triumph was gone, his self-confidence fading with every minute of the meeting, and it was replaced by tense silence and barely concealed panic. He didn't look like a winner anymore. He looked like a man who realized that he had made the biggest mistake of his life. Melissa, of course, was noticeably absent. Office gossip informed me that she had already switched to a new object of attention, a colleague of her own age, more stable, and more importantly, financially independent. Alan appeared in the courtroom in his old clothes. The designer wardrobe, which he so proudly displayed, had apparently been sold or returned in an attempt to cover at least some of the debts. His lawyer looked tired, as if he'd spent the last few weeks desperately trying to find loopholes in my impeccably documented financial history. "Your Honor," he began in a last attempt to bargain, "despite the separate documentation of the property, my client contributed to the development of his wife's business through moral support." My lawyer didn't even let him finish. "Moral support? What is it?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "You mean this?" He spread out several printed screenshots in front of the judge. Mr. Harrison's messages disparaging Mrs. Harrison's business as her little shop, or maybe this. He pushed aside a stack of papers, revealing another document. His posts on social media where he calls the boutique her hobby that distracts her from real life. The judge flipped through the papers and slowly put them aside. "I think I've seen enough." The final settlement fully reflected my careful planning. I've kept my house. She kept her business. She kept all her separate assets. Alan received his personal belongings and a car that cost less than he owed for it. As we were leaving the courtroom, he stopped next to me, his face distorted with anger and impotent resentment. "You destroyed me," he hissed. "I'll have to go back to live with my parents." I looked at him, lingering on his face a little longer than I should have, and smiling, calmly replied, "No, Alan, you destroyed yourself. I just made sure that you didn't destroy me." His mother was waiting outside, ready to take him home, his new home. At 45, he returned to his childhood bedroom, while I continued to build a successful business, which he always underestimated. He turned to me with a final accusation. "You planned all this, you knew this would happen." I shook my head. "No, Alan, I was just paying attention. And unlike you, I understood the value of keeping good records." Wearily, his mother stepped between us, her fingers clenched on his sleeve. "That's enough, Alan. You've already embarrassed yourself enough." When they left, I could hear her scolding him. "Honestly, what were you thinking about? A 20-year-old guy emptying bank accounts, sending these terrible messages." I watched them disappear into the parking lot and felt nothing but relief. Alan thought he had put an end to our story with his cruel, parting gift. But really, he just set my carefully thought-out plans in motion. My phone vibrated. But this time, it wasn't messages from Alan. These were notifications about new orders on my boutique's website. Life was moving forward, just not in the direction he imagined. It's been 6 months since the divorce was finalized. My boutique expanded. Now I had a second location in the city center, in a better area with even more traffic. I couldn't help but notice the irony of what was happening. While Alan was struggling to rebuild his life, the little shop that he always called so disparagingly was thriving. I hired 3 new employees, launched an online store that was rapidly gaining momentum across the country, and watched, not without satisfaction, as my business reached a new level. While news about Alan's situation continued to filter through to me through mutual acquaintances, as a reminder of how much can change. Life, if you make the right decisions in time. He tried to create a profile in dating apps, but quickly discovered that women his age were not eager to date a middle-aged man living in his parents' house, and young girls, having learned about his story from office gossip, preferred to stay away from him. Melissa, apparently, did not just leave, but warned all her friends about who they might encounter, shared screenshots of his desperate attempts to bring her back, complaints, reproaches, insults, and then threats in chat rooms when he realized that he would not be able to convince her to change her mind. His career suffered too. After complaining to the HR department about his relationship with a subordinate, an official investigation began, which ended with a disciplinary reprimand, and the promotion he had been waiting for so long went to another person, someone who had no history of inappropriate relationships with the reception staff. He tried to claim age discrimination. They're just punishing him for dating someone younger, his sister Amanda told me during an unexpected visit to the boutique, absently sorting through the silk scarves on the counter. And what did they say to him? I asked, even though I had already guessed the sequel. The HR department just added this complaint to his file. She grinned, shook her head, and picked up an elegant bag, clearly more to occupy her fingers than out of real interest. I was surprised to see her in my store, but her presence spoke volumes about how thoroughly Alan had alienated even the people closest to him. I know we didn't support you at first, she confessed, running her fingers over the soft fabric of her scarf. He played the role of the victim so well, he was so convincing, but then we saw how he dealt with everything that happened after, how he behaved. I am ashamed that we once believed him. I didn't say anything, just nodded, because no words would have mattered at that moment. My lawyer kept me informed of Alan's further attempts to challenge the divorce agreement. Each petition was rejected. His claim for an unfair asset allocation was dismissed based on evidence of his own actions. He was actually trying to claim that his account emptying message was just a joke, the lawyer told me, barely able to contain her laughter. The judge asked him, "Does haha make stealing less illegal?" I smiled, imagining the look on Alan's face at that moment. The boutique's success brought unexpected bonuses. Local business magazines wanted to publish my story, but not as the story of a despised wife, but as a story about a woman who managed not only to protect her interests, but also to take her business to a new level. Young entrepreneurs began to seek advice. How to properly separate business and personal finances. One girl asked me, reminding me of Melissa, but unlike her, with a greedy gleam in her eyes that betrayed that she wanted to learn and understand, and not just follow someone. The best defense is preparation, I replied, smiling a little, and always trust your intuition. Alan's mother called from time to time, usually after he made another mistake that made his situation worse. He tried gambling online, hoping for a quick solution to his financial problems. He got involved in a pyramid scheme that promised instant profits. Every attempt to return to his old way of life only drove him deeper into trouble. I do not know where we went wrong, his mother sighed during one of these calls. His father and I offered to help him get back on his feet if he would just take responsibility for his actions, but he still blames everyone else. You, Melissa, your company, the judge. I listened politely, but kept my distance. Their family drama was no longer my problem. My life was moving forward, filled with plans for a third boutique, negotiations to expand into the luxury accessories segment, new opportunities, new challenges, new horizons that opened up before me now that I was no longer wasting my energy on someone who was dragging me down. The only reminder of Alan's influence on my life was the frame hanging in my office. It contained a screenshot of his last message, sent before I blocked his number. "Have fun with your little shop. At least he'll keep you busy in your old age." Under this screenshot was my latest business award. Proof that sometimes the best revenge is just to succeed on your own terms. A year after the divorce, I held the grand opening of my third boutique, a stylish, thoughtful event that attracted not only long-time customers, but also the attention of local media, who now wanted to tell the story not about an unhappy marriage and betrayal, but about a woman who turned her business into a thriving chain of stores, about a businesswoman, which expanded its brand, about a man who not only managed to protect himself, but also used the experience as fuel for his growth. Alan's betrayal was now just a footnote in my success story, one of the episodes that in retrospect seemed not a tragedy, but a catalyst for change, an impetus for me to stand up even more firmly on my feet and see what I was really capable of. During the event, I was talking with potential partners, discussing plans for further development with investors, and listening to live customer reviews when I noticed a figure out of the corner of my eye that I never expected to see here. Melissa. She looked younger than I remembered her, or maybe I just felt a lot stronger than the last time I saw her. She stood hesitantly at the entrance, clutching her purse in her hands as if it were a shield protecting her from possible condemnation. I didn't take a step towards her. It was her choice to come here, and I wasn't going to make it easier for her. She stepped forward, stopped next to me, barely meeting my gaze, and finally said softly, "I owe you an apology." I was silent, waiting for him to continue. "I believed everything he told me, about how you were cold and controlled, how you didn't support his dreams. I thought he was unhappy, that you were suppressing him, and then I watched as he tried to apply the same manipulation tactics to me when things went badly." I continued to lay out new models of designer sunglasses in the window. "Those weren't his dreams, Melissa. They were escapes. There is a difference." She nodded. "I know that now." She thought for a moment, as if deciding to say something else, and then added, "He tried to move in with me when you froze the accounts. I thought my studio apartment was a temporary option. After 2 weeks of him complaining about the size of my closet and offering me a loan for a bigger apartment, I realized what you meant when you talked about the difference between dreams and escapes." I actually laughed. "Let me guess, he had big plans, but there was no way to finance them. Will everything definitely work out as soon as his investment pays off? As soon as he gets this promotion? As soon as his cryptocurrency certainly rises in value?" She sighed, shaking her head. "That's right." "And where is he now?" "I don't know," she shrugged, "and I don't want to know." She paused, as if gathering her courage, and added, "I'm dating someone my age now. We have student loans and a small apartment, but at least we're building something real." I nodded. When she left, my assistant manager leaned over to me and whispered, "Is that the girl?" I shook my head. "No, she's just another woman who has learned the same lesson as me." Speaking of lessons, I motioned to a young couple looking at our designer bags and addressed them. "Let's talk about your idea of expanding our line of accessories." The boutique stopped being just a business for me a long time ago. Now it was a symbol of independence, resilience, strength, and preparation. Young entrepreneurs often turn to me for advice, and I always emphasized one thing. It is important not only to develop a business, it's important to protect him. Alan's mother called for the last time, but not to justify him or to plead for him. "I just wanted to thank you," she said. I was surprised. "For what?" "You have taught our family an important lesson about how we condoned bad behavior, about how the cruelty was justified." She paused before adding, "Alan still lives at home. He still blames everyone else for his problems. You, Melissa, your company, the judge. But we're not protecting him anymore." She sighed. "This is your legacy in our family. You've shown us the difference between supporting someone and blindly indulging their weaknesses." I listened, but I didn't say anything. I no longer needed a confession or a belated apology. I was thinking about this legacy when I was reviewing plans to open a fourth boutique. Alan had once intended to humiliate me, trade me for a younger woman, take half of everything I'd built. Instead, he unknowingly pushed me to become even stronger, even more successful. My phone vibrated, a message from my lawyer. "Alan has filed another motion to review the settlement agreement." The judge immediately dismissed it and ordered him to pay the court costs. "I thought you'd like this." I smiled, imagining him in his childhood bedroom, still trying to rewrite the ending that was predetermined at the very moment when he underestimated me. Sometimes the best revenge is not to settle scores. It's about getting better. 2 years after Alan's brutal text message, I stood on stage in front of hundreds of women gathered at the annual conference for businesswomen. The topic of my speech was not about divorce or betrayal. These were no longer the defining themes of my story. I talked about building and protecting a successful business, about foresight, about how important it is to know the value of your work and never allow someone to devalue your achievements. My story turned from a cautionary tale about a failed marriage into a story of inspiration, about a woman who not only managed to survive, but also turned her life into something much bigger than she had ever imagined before. During the Q&A session, one of the participants raised her hand. "How did you separate business and personal finances?" "What is it?" she asked. "My husband says that I'm paranoid, that marriage is about trust, about shared dreams, about sharing everything." I smiled, cocking my head a little to one side, and letting a moment's pause hang in the air, I replied. "My ex-husband said the same thing, right up to the moment when he tried to claim half of my business during the divorce." There was a slight murmur of approval from the audience. "Trust your instincts. Protection is not paranoia, but a reasonable precaution." I knew what I was talking about. My boutique network has grown to 5 outlets, each of which has proved more successful than the previous one, and the small store that Alan once despised has now become a workplace for 30 people. They wrote about him in national business magazines, invited him to conferences, and did case studies for young entrepreneurs. And Alan's. Through mutual acquaintances, I heard that he had finally moved away from his parents, but not to the spacious house with a swimming pool he dreamed of, but to a tiny apartment above the garage. He had to take a low-paying job after his former company restructured and eliminated his position. His profile on dating sites still stated that he was young at heart, although the photo he used was clearly taken about 10 years ago. Melissa, ironically, became a regular customer at my first boutique. One day, while choosing a bag, she told me, "You inspired me." I raised an eyebrow and she smiled. "You have shown that a woman can build something lasting instead of giving in to empty promises." Now she has earned a degree in business and has founded her own consulting company. I just nodded. We were both victims of the same illusion at one time, but unlike Alan, we learned from it. The violent text message he sent me 2 years ago was still framed in my office. Not as a reminder of the pain, and as proof of how low he has sunk and how high I have risen. It hung there as a symbol that success is the best revenge. On the day of the celebration of the 5th anniversary of my first boutique, I stood in a hall filled with employees, customers, and friends, and realized how far I had come from the moment when this business was just one small point of sale. It was now the flagship store of a thriving business empire. When the crowd thinned out a bit, a woman I hadn't expected to see approached me. Alan's mother. She didn't get an invitation, but she came anyway. I calmly waited for her to tell me why she was here. She ran her hand along the hem of her designer dress, one of the ones that were sold in my store. I saw Alan yesterday, she said casually, but there was more to her voice. I didn't answer. He's still talking about his glory days, about the life I could have had. She looked at me carefully, with some new understanding in her eyes. He still doesn't understand that he didn't lose everything in the divorce. He threw it away. I didn't say anything. I was just thinking about the very message that started it all, about his careless cruelty, about his confidence that I would fall apart without him, about how he expected me to beg him to stay, that I would break down to prove to him that his beliefs were right. Instead, I built something much stronger than before. Every new boutique opening, every new contract, every victory, all this was evidence of what women can achieve when they stop being tarnished by insecure men. A young saleswoman I hired a month ago approached me with a question about the new inventory system. Ironically, her name was Melissa. While I was explaining the process to her, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in a store window, and then I finally realized what Alan couldn't see 5 years ago. This was not a woman who was getting old. There was a woman in front of me who had become wiser, stronger, more successful. His violent text message was supposed to be the end. Instead, it became the beginning, not just for me, but also for every woman who has heard my story and realized that she deserves better than someone else's midlife crisis.